Hi everyone, my name is Lauren Patterson and I'll be presenting Making Sense of Mid-Century Commercial Architecture. A little bit about me. I recently graduated from the University of Georgia's Master of Historic Preservation program. I now live in Birmingham, Alabama and work as an architectural historian for TerraXplorations, a cultural resource management firm. I'll be moving through this pretty quickly to go over everything, but I've included my contact information there at the bottom if you'd like to get in touch to discuss anything further. Today I'm going to go over my research framework and purpose, a national historic context, the building typology and character-defining features that I identified, preservation challenges, what you can look for in your own hometown, and then I'll answer some questions. I've also included some recommended resources at the end of the slide, so if you have access to them, there's some further reading and research that you can do. I'll begin by going over my research framework and purpose. This presentation stems from my thesis research. And for my thesis, I wanted to study something that was relevant and pertinent in preservation by beginning to tackle how we're going to approach the massive amount of building stock from the mid to late 20th century. Because taking on such a big swath of resources is a daunting task, I broke it down to only focus on the city of Athens, Georgia, and only look at a specific category of commercial buildings during a specific time period. I studied buildings categorized as single-tenant retail or commercial buildings and malls, shopping centers, or multi-tenant commercial structures built between 1930 and 1981. The categories are somewhat arbitrary labels that were derived from the Athens-Clarke County organization system, and your hometown may or may not have a similar way of labeling buildings for tax purposes. The real point of using the labels is to have a more defined grouping of buildings to study and draw accurate conclusions. For example, I didn't want to lump in shopping centers with drive-through fast food restaurants and treat them the same because each has its own design context. The dates are specific to Athens and chosen because 1930 marks when the streetcar system ended, and 1981 is when the Georgia Square Mall was opened. This is a wide swath to consider quote-unquote mid-century, but I wanted to capture the pertinent events that had an impact on development in the period of significance. Though my research was specific to Athens, the city did not exist in a bubble and was on par with trends that took place around the state of Georgia and the rest of the country. So even though you'll be seeing a lot of Athens and Georgia examples, you'll find that the same trends probably existed in your own town. The end result of my research was to identify categories for grouping and understanding commercial design, as well as character-defining features that make a building unique and should be respected as its use evolves. Because of my specific scope of building categories and focus on Athens, this is by no means a comprehensive system, but rather just a way to begin thinking about identifying modern commercial design with the goal of future preservation. To do all this, I created a list of target resources based on those dates and categories I mentioned. I had built a survey form that accurately captured modern commercial characteristics, and I got on the field. Using my surveys and photos, along with extensive contextual research, I created the typology and identified character-defining features that you will later see. To provide background for my survey, I researched the national historic context from which modern commercial design arose. I've included examples from Athens and around Georgia to illustrate how the context played out at the state and local levels. Some of the influences that happened throughout the United States included a departure from classical architecture and experimentation with new styles and building methods, a population shift away from downtowns to suburbs, the use of new and prefabricated building materials, and retail becoming an art and science to be studied and refined, as well as the general action and reaction to trends. The changing landscape of American cities is what enabled modern commercial design to develop. Traditionally, cities were constrained to a central commercial node due to limited mobility. Beginning with widespread implementation of the electric streetcar in the late 1800s, cities began to expand along linear streetcar routes. In the streetcar business, the real cash cow was real estate development rather than paid ridership. Similar to traditional downtown buildings, quote-unquote taxpayer buildings were built close to the street and sandwiched together. They were meant to go up quickly and cheaply to make money from the land along the streetcar route while it appreciated. And they became the sort of evolutionary link between historic downtown business districts and suburban shopping centers. What the streetcar companies and developers didn't anticipate was how cars would allow infill between routes, creating a more circular city. Once car production became efficient and affordable, ownership skyrocketed. And with more cars came the demand for better roads to allow motorists to go far beyond their traditional confines. This diagram is meant to illustrate the evolution of parking. At first, buildings were sited close to the street and designed for pedestrians. As cars became more prevalent, downtowns tried to make room for street parking. Then we see novel layouts for parking incorporated into the shopping experience. And finally, we get what we see commonly today, with the storefront being far removed from the street and designed completely for cars rather than pedestrians. I like this series of photos to illustrate this evolution. This is in Athens. And you can see at first there are horse and buggies coexisting with streetcars. This is looking at the same street now with cars coexisting with the streetcars. And finally, you can see that the streetcars are gone and street parking has been incorporated. The Park and Shop in DC was the first shopping center in the country to be laid out for multiple cars. You see there on the left. And in Georgia, the Rhodes Center was the first strip shopping center, and the Briarcliff Plaza was the first to include off-street parking. And these were all built in the 1930s. With those influences in mind, specific phases of commercial design have been identified. These are derived from Larry Ford's book, Cities and Buildings, where he looked at national trends, and I chose photos from Athens and around Georgia that corresponded. As the phases progress, note that they move further and further away from town's historic central business districts. First, we see the early auto strip, when Americans were first getting accustomed to newfound mobility in never-before-seen building forms like the gas station. To bring familiarity to novel forms, buildings use kitschy and residential design, such as applying Tudor style to existing gas station. In order to flag down customers, we see the rise of corporate branding. As the car became more widespread, we see uniform laws, lighting, and signs applied to roads during the streamlined strip phase. This is a time when technology was being embraced, and the streamlined strip design was meant to reflect speed, slickness, and modernity. It played off of mechanical designs and emulated boats and airplanes with streamlined modern style. Next comes the post-war consumer boom in design that we associate with classic car culture. For the first time, a true commercial architecture emerges, described as overstated functionalism. The dates of this period were chosen by Ford, with 1940 being when the first McDonald's opened, and 1973 when the OPEC oil embargo took place. The majority of the resources that I surveyed for my thesis fell within this time period. During the classic auto strip era, cars were big enough to take the family out for a drive, to eat in, and to watch movies. Businesses were designed to be flashy and transparent with bright neon lights and lots of glass so that motorists would be drawn in from the street. Signs were especially important and designed to incorporate with the building. Here are some examples of overstated functionalism in Athens. You can see the emphasis on geometric shapes that seem like they move and pull in the customer, as well as transparency so that the interior product and buzz can be seen from the street. This era is prior to when sign ordinances went in effect in most cities, so signs could be big and flashy, and any thoroughfare could resemble a Las Vegas strip. Here are some survivors I've seen around the state. I especially love the Big Chicken in Marietta. During this time is also when many cities got their first shopping centers, complete with a sea of asphalt. They'd often be built in conjunction with the ranch house neighborhood of the same name. In Athens, it was the Beechwood Shopping Center and the corresponding Beechwood neighborhood. You can see from the aerial that it was just carved out of former woods and pasture land. Flashy designs were widely shared through publications that espoused how storefronts could be designed to update the old and maximize profits. There is an emergence of experts such as Morris Lapidus, Morris Ketchum Jr., Raymond Loewy, and Victor Gruen, whose designs were shared in publications like Architectural Record and Sweets Catalog. I stumbled upon this myself because I thought this building in Athens was really unique and interesting with its relief above the door. And then I went down to Savannah and found two more of the exact same building within a few blocks of each other. So obviously this was a design that was popular and widely shared. In that cycle of action and reaction to trends, there is a pushback against the flashiness of the classic auto strip. So next comes the environmental era, a reaction to mass waste and destruction caused by consumerism in building. As I said, this coincides with the oil embargo. It's also a product of the environmental movement and realization that our reliance on vehicles and convenience destroys both the natural and built environments. During this era, the effects of zoning and sign ordinances are beginning to be seen, resulting in less of the visual clutter of the classic strip. The shift in design is illustrated here by the corporate design of McDonald's in 1955 versus 1985. You can see the 1985 version has a much more muted and toned down back to nature look. And this era is also when the sort of faux mansard becomes popular. The last phase I'll touch on is the rise of the corporate megastrip, which still continues today. The megastrip is essentially a small city unto itself, with shops, medical offices, office parks, and accompanying housing. The design tends to favor postmodern, overblown classical motifs with pediments and columns, and these are located close to interstates and highways. Although there are other more recent trends, such as new urbanism, that are noteworthy, they did not come into play with my research. And prevalent with the culture of the 1980s and 90s, malls brought consumers out from the suburban shopping centers to the peripheries of town. The Georgia Square Mall was opened in 1981 in Athens, and as a result, consumers were driven further away from downtown, and many of the businesses suffered. If you're a Stranger Things fan, you'll notice in this last season how they show how the downtown suffers from the novelty and culture of the mall. With the historic context in mind, I went out and surveyed my resources to develop a typology to use in describing and categorizing them. I did this based on Dr. Richard Longstreth's original work in the book, The Building of Main Street. The goal was not for the typology to be a gauge of a building's worth, but rather a way to describe it and spot commonalities. I broke it down into 3 descending steps. First, to look at the overall composition, next at the roofline, and finally at the storefront composition, which I describe with both elevation and visibility. Overall composition describes the big picture shape of the building. I identified 4 categories I labeled as 1-story unified block, 2-story unified block, elongated to the street, and shopping center. Here are examples of each. Next, I looked at roofline. Rather than describing the roof form, this was more so the treatment of the roof. In some cases, such as gabled, the form and treatment are one and the same. In many cases with modern commercial buildings, the roof is flat with an applied roof line at 1 or more elevations. The categories I identified included exaggerated sign band, false front, flush or vanishing, gabled, geometric, integrated canopy, mansard, representational, and hybrid. Finally, I looked at storefront composition, and I broke this down into both elevation and visibility. Elevations I described as recessed, flush, or projecting. And visibility I described as directed view or visual front. I then looked at character-defining features, which are those characteristics that are essential to communicating the building's design intent. I based these on the features identified by the National Park Service. The NPS breaks down character-defining features as overall visual aspects and visual character at close range. I've included illustrations of each with the yellow highlighting the feature. We have shape, openings, roofs and their related features, projections, trim, setting, signs, which is a category not included by the NPS but integral for commercial architecture, and finally materials and craftsmanship. While I was surveying and looking at character-defining features, I noticed a couple trends in loss of integrity in character-defining features. One was that the minimalist and sort of neutral, muted look where red brick is painted and simple metal details are applied. Another trend is applying overblown classical motifs like pediments and columns and stucco to the facades. My personal favorite is at the bottom right. You can see where a new treatment was applied, but they didn't bother to remove the parapets that are behind it, so you can see exactly what the building had going on before they modified it. I noted that integrity could also be planned, like with the corporate branding of U-Haul, versus a more ad hoc agglomeration of changes over time that you see on the right that doesn't really have a master plan to it. And I've included some of the best examples that I found during surveying for which I would recommend preservation. These are some good examples of architecture of their time, and they retain a good amount of integrity. But of course, with preservation, we recognize that there are challenges to it, and modern commercial resources present a new host of challenges that we typically don't encounter with more traditional historic resources. Some of these include the sheer volume of resources that resulted from the post-World War II building boom and the efficiency with which buildings went up, the experimental nature of building materials that were developed during World War II and the space race, public perception that preservation should be geared more towards older and traditional resources, and the nature of commerce itself, which is always changing to keep pace with consumer tastes and remain relevant. With all this in mind, I'll conclude by providing some things that helped guide my research and you can look for in your own town. If you have access to the slides, I've also included some recommended resources at the end. Some of the things to consider are when and where do streetcars run, where were the earliest post-World War II suburbs and corresponding commercial areas, what influence did new commercial development have on the traditional downtown, how does your Preservation Council address quote-unquote modern historic resources, and if there's a social media group or historic group that posts photos and stories that can help fill in the gaps of what went on. If you don't know where to begin, these are some great parameters to provide dates and just background information of what might be out there. Thank you for listening. My hope is now that you can have some more background knowledge and examples of what to look for, and you'll see that the story that modern commercial design tells in your own hometown. May I answer any questions?